Okay, so welcome everyone to our can I even pronounce that? Naftapocalypse panel, looking at the latest developments under NAFTA. We have, I hope, a very interesting, well, we have a very distinguished set of panelists and hopefully an extremely interesting discussion as well, given that all of these issues are playing out as we go along. Let me just give you sort of a brief anecdote of how this event came about. So a couple of weeks ago, I was walking out, going to across the street to, actually nearby to across the street from me, but to Brookings for lunch, and I ran into Mary and another colleague of ours from the Peterson Institute, where I'm also affiliated, and then Chris walked by. And the four of us got into a conversation about NAFTA, evidently, because the announcement had just been made that the US and Mexico had struck a deal. And in the middle of that conversation, suddenly one of us said, we need to do an event about this. And here we are. So that's how we got here. Now, having said how we got here, let me introduce myself. I'm Monica de Bolle, the director of the Latin American Studies program and also the Emerging Market specialization. Sitting here immediately to my right is Mary Lovely, who's a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. She's also a professor at Syracuse University. And then to her right is Inu Manak, who is a visiting scholar at the CATO Institute. So with that, let me open up our initial remarks. The idea is that we have sort of a fairly informal discussion between the three of us, and then we're going to switch over to a second panel looking at the politics of everything that's going on from the Mexican perspective and from the Canadian perspective. So just to give a brief introduction to all of you, as you know, the U.S. has recently announced that it struck a deal with Mexico, and Canada had been, up to that point, sort of out of the discussions. It's now been brought back into the discussions, but nothing has really progressed. And the latest news that we have is that negotiations are ongoing, which means that negotiations are ongoing, and we really have nothing more that we can say. However, on the Mexico-U.S. deal, the interesting thing is that what came out in terms of the deal, the document that USTR actually published said that it is a preliminary agreement in principle, which in itself is something that's kind of hard, the language of which is kind of hard to disentangle. Right? What is a preliminary agreement in principle? It's certainly not a deal set in stone, and it's certainly something that is going to be subject to a lot more back and forth. Within that deal, there were three things that sort of stood out. The first was the issue of rules of origin, which we will get into in the panel. Rules of origin, specifically on the auto sector, were raised from 62.5%, or the agreement in principle is that they be raised from 62.5% to 75%. As many of you in the room know, rules of origin they're a staple of trade agreements, and what they usually specify is how much content in a given product has to be sourced from within the region. So the 62.5 rule was basically saying that 62.5% of anything produced within North America had to be sourced within North America, and now that's up to 75. The second element of what was announced was that out of auto productions, 40 to 45% of what is produced has to be produced by workers that are earning at least $16 an hour in wages. This is probably the first time that a minimum wage requirement has been built into a trade agreement. As all of you know, minimum wage issues and minimum wage policy is usually subject to a lot of political, is a very politically charged issue, to say the least. And having that in a trade agreement with no clear enforceability is certainly another issue that I think we should discuss here in the panel. And then finally, there is apparently a side letter to what was agreed that basically stipulates that imports of automobiles from Mexico may be limited. So there may be an import cap. And there's no clarity really on what that side letter says, but it seems to imply that that cap would be in place in order for Mexico not to be hit by the potential auto tariffs that the U.S. is intending to impose on other trading partners. This is, just to remind all of you, under the Section 232, the national security investigation that the Trump administration has launched on several different products. It has already done so for aluminum and steel, as you all know, and it's now, there's a report that's due to come out on autos, and there is a threat that tariffs on autos imported from other countries here in the U.S. may rise to 20 to 25%. The current WTO most favored nation tariff for countries that trade with the U.S. on autos is 2.5. So that would be a very big bump, and it would make cars very expensive, which is something that my colleague Mary Lovely has done a lot of work on. So I won't talk anymore. Let me pass the word first to Mary and then to Inu to make some remarks on some of these issues that I've mentioned at the outset. Mary.
Thanks, Monica. I think that brings us up to date because there's still so much that we don't know where this will end up. I want to sort of step back and take a bigger view of how this fits in more to the Trump administration's general approach to trade policy. My particular area of expertise is trade with China. So although I did write a case study for the Kennedy School years ago, 1994, when the United States signed the NAFTA agreement, and I was on Capitol Hill the day of the vote. Very exciting, although many of us who are Americans will remember that when we signed an agreement with Canada, which is a much larger economy, most Americans had no idea it was happening. At the time when we signed the agreement with Mexico, however, an economy that at that time was about the size of the economy of Los Angeles, everybody was up in arms that it was truly a Naftapocalypse. So this is the second one that we've had. And I think it speaks to the fears that people have of trade with lower income countries in the United States. Stepping back and looking what's happening with NAFTA in a wider context, I'm reminded first of the agreement that the Trump administration has signed with South Korea. It's not a renegotiation, of course. It's a slight tweaking, shall we say, of course. Basically, granted exemption from steel and aluminum tariffs to South Korea by basically forcing South Korea to engage in managed trade. And managed trade, I think, is a good way to think about what's happening. Particularly in the traditional heavy industries that this administration favors, such as autos, steel, and aluminum, and we may see other appliances early on under a different part of the U.S. law, but nevertheless, more mainline traditional industries. Now, one may say, just look at an election map, and you'll figure out why those are the industries that are being chosen, and that may be true, but it goes back to this sort of belief that these are the key to a strong and prosperous nation. So I think we're really looking back at a kind of mindset and a worldview that is shared by many people in the administration and many people, I would say, in the voting public. So we see a move toward managed trade. The unfortunate thing about the NAFTA agreement is that it's clear that that's going to be coming out. The auto industry provisions that Monica just spoke about are clearly the most obvious example of this, but President Trump's focus on supply management for dairy also speaks to this idea, because he certainly well knows that we also have dairy management in the United States. When we look even more broadly, we look at what's happening with the European Union. The European Union seems to believe that it can head off problems with autos, and auto tariffs hitting European Union would be a gigantic, I would say seismic, shock to the global trading system. They believe they can head it off, but President Trump is already talking like a man who wants managed trade. When the European Union has suggested that they would remove all tariffs on autos, he said that wasn't good enough because they wouldn't be buying our automobiles, seeming to completely dismiss the fact that Ford, for example, produces automobiles quite successfully for the European market in the region. So we have a general tendency towards basically managed trade. It seems to grow with each passing week. China seems to be the one exception. Everybody agrees that it's time to gang up on China. I would question whether this is really what we want. It's been a long time since we really talked about how we can move forward in a cooperative way to create a peaceful and successful trading environment, trading rules. And maybe it's time that those of us who are in the academic community and other communities really start to think about alternatives to managed trade. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mary. And just on the issue that Mary mentioned, Quotas, so this is the South Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. It is important to note that apart from the managed trade perspective that these renegotiations took, there's an additional thing. The renegotiations took place, but the actual renegotiation, the actual agreement, renegotiated agreement, has not yet been signed. So this is something that could, under what's currently happening with NAFTA, that could very well happen with NAFTA. So in other words, it's very possible that we might have these ongoing negotiations and these announcements of deals or preliminary agreements in principle that really aren't actual deals that have been negotiated at all, but are wide open, and thus what still remains in place is not the renegotiated deal, but indeed what was already in place in the first place, namely the NAFTA that was negotiated 24 years ago. Inu, please.
Sure. So I just want to pick up on a theme that Mary brought up and how we broadly think about NAFTA. When we think about what brought President Trump to office, is that he rallied on this idea of this populist agenda. Part of it was saying we're going to tackle trade and make it better for everybody. So we think about that framework when we have to look at what he's done and what he's proposed to make this better for everybody. Well, we look at Chorus and we see that with Chorus there were small tweaks, not many changes. It doesn't have to go back to Congress for a vote. There are small things that kind of make it look that we made it better by getting a little bit more autos into Korea, which we might not get because increasing a quota doesn't mean Koreans all of a sudden like American cars. So that's not really going to change preferences that people have. But in addition to that, having these voluntary export restraints on steel. This is a trade policy that's straight out of the 1980s. It's something Bob Lighthizer knows very, very well. And we have things that have been proposed that essentially are, as Mary said, managed trade. These aren't the ways to actually improve trade agreements, not the discussions that academics and other scholars have been having about how to improve trade at all. So in that sense, it's a very different agenda, and this is what he calls his populist agenda. When we look at NAFTA, we look at the things that have been the focus. Autos, steel, and when we look at what's come out of the negotiations, again, we're seeing kind of things working on the margins. We're seeing auto rules of origins being tightened, and in fact, rules of origin across the board from the document that USTR released have been tightened. To put it in perspective, NAFTA already has some of the most stringent rules of origin of any agreement in the world. So to make this even tougher, it's very clear what the goal is here, is to limit the imports of non-North American products into the North American marketplace. But in addition to that, there's a specific goal of increasing US production in all of these inputs as well. And the textiles is a good example of that, with the increasing of tightening the US products in the yarn forward rule that's put there. So in many ways, this is the vision that we need essentially to become more of an autarkic sort of nation. And that's sort of what's being put forward, I think, in the NAFTA talks. And what I see in terms of the provisions that are being put forward are not this revitalization and revisioning of NAFTA to make it really better, but really to kind of scale it back and take a lot of the free trade out of NAFTA. And that is inherently problematic. Second, I think it's also problematic in the fact that how the negotiations are being handled, where we are isolating some long-term partners and friends and allies that have been with us from the very beginning through a lot of difficult things, and where we're challenging notions of globalized supply chains and the way that things are actually made today. Autos is the greatest example of this. We have an integrated supply chain where we aren't just making parts in one place and then putting the whole car together and sending it to another country. We're actually making things together. And so you have across the border from Detroit and Oshawa, Ontario, you're getting things going back and forth throughout the day. Right? So we're talking about billions of dollars of trade, and we're 3 countries building these things together, and that's pretty impressive. If you put a tariff, it's the equivalent of basically putting a wall in the middle of a factory floor, and that's what's being proposed in many ways. So I think the one way to think about NAFTA in this context right now is what's the main goal and the aim that the administration has in going forward with this. And if this is the template that they're going to put on the rest of the world with the negotiations that are going to happen in the future, that's something to be quite concerned about. And in the NAFTA context, what we really have to be careful about is that we have intertwined economies that can be very disrupted depending on where these rules land. And so once we see the final text of this, which I'm very excited to see if it comes out at the end of next month, then we're going to start digging at it and try and find exactly who's going to get hurt and who's going to benefit. And until then, we're going to have to wait and see.
Yeah, but with that in mind, one thing, and picking up on Inu's comments, one thing we can already say, which is if some of these things, especially on autos, but also on other products, if some of these things do come into effect, and if some of these walls are being built, as Inu very well illustrated, within factories and within supply chains, there are 2 things that might happen. One is that companies might try to get around those walls. So by trying to get around those walls, they would basically not fulfill the requirements and the criteria that have currently been put in place or are currently being negotiated. And by going around that, these companies would then have to start paying the most favored nation tariff, which on autos happens to be 2.5%, but it's a lot of stuff going back and forth across the border. So you don't pay 2.5% once, you probably pay it many times over. And that, of course, has implications ultimately for how much cars are going to cost in North America in general. So that's one first point. The second point is that supply chains would have to, if they were to abide by these new rules, they would have to completely reorganize and restructure themselves, which is also extremely costly. So this is also going to have a price impact. This is also going to have an impact on the prices of cars within the North American region, which brings to light one point about NAFTA that is it's a very stark point. When NAFTA came into effect, the years after NAFTA came into effect, the North American region became extremely competitive in the auto sector. So whereas it was suffering in the 1980s, the reason for why a lot of these managed trade practices and measures were put in place, because it was having all this competition from Japan, chiefly from Japan, but then later from other Asian countries. With NAFTA, this industry became extremely competitive within North America. So ultimately, what all of these measures are doing is taking away those competitiveness gains from one very important sector for all 3 countries involved, and sort of regressing back to a time when the region was not competitive. And that is certainly something that is harmful to all within this broad context of managed trade. Mary, I want to go back to the issue of higher prices for autos that I was talking just before, because you had a very interesting piece, which I hope you can talk a little bit about, on what happens. This is not NAFTA related as such, but it could come into play under NAFTA. As I mentioned before, there is currently an ongoing 232 national security investigation on automobiles. And there may come a point when these new tariffs, 20, 25%, whatever they might be, will be imposed on cars that are imported from outside of the U.S. So Mary had a very interesting, has a very interesting paper that she authored alongside two other colleagues at the Peterson Institute, looking exactly at what those impacts might be. And I just would like you to say something about that.
Well, let me just talk about why it's related to NAFTA. As Monica mentioned, the tariff, the MFN tariff on autos is 2.5% in the United States. So if the United States ratchets up the requirements for automakers to access 0% movement of vehicles across the two boundaries, it may be that the automakers simply turn around and say that, well, we'll just forget it and we'll pay the 2.5%. You know, for example, if you have 40% of the vehicle has to be made with labor that's earning $16 an hour, you know, less expensive automobiles where competition is very fierce, you may say it's not, I cannot sell the vehicle unless I produce more of it in Mexico, as I have been doing, and therefore I will not meet the higher standards, I'll simply pay the higher tariff. When you think about it this way, you begin to realize that it seems that the 25% tariffs are coming, because otherwise, all this attention to raising the cost of producing automobiles in the North American region doesn't make any sense, because automakers would simply just throw up their hands and say, we'll pay the 2.5%. I think that's a big signal to all of us that these auto tariffs are very seriously under consideration. What does it mean for the United States? Monica mentioned our policy brief, trying to figure out what the cost effect would be. And of course, it varies by market segment. For low-end vehicles, we would see anywhere from $1,500 to $2,500. For luxury vehicles, more in the region of $4,000. So it's quite a big hit. There is no such thing as a fully American-made vehicle, so every vehicle would be hit to some extent. We find that the vehicles that have more North American, particularly American content, well, actually, I should say Canadian-American. We can't even sort out this production process is so intertwined that we don't know how much American versus Canadian content. And people who say that they can do that really don't, in my mind, have very good methodology. So they're adding in a whole bunch of other stuff that really isn't what we're talking about. I have no idea how the customs will be able to figure out how to actually tax imports of autos and auto parts from Canada. It's just sort of unthinkable up till now. So anyway, just looking at American and Canadian content, you see that vehicles that are not really popular, that hit smaller niche markets, are those which have less American and Canadian content, are more at risk. So if you're a type of person who likes Italian sports cars or Japanese luxury vehicles or kind of quirky little vehicles that get great gas mileage, you're the one who's probably going to be driving a vehicle that has less American and Canadian content. And you will probably face a higher price increase. Having said that, every vehicle will face a price increase, because if you were alive in the 1980s, you know exactly what happened with the voluntary export restraints from Japan. All of a sudden, the US auto prices went way up, even though, of course, they were restraining the Japanese. Here we'll see vehicles that are hit with high tariffs. As those manufacturers try to raise the price, it'll push demand toward vehicles that have more American content, such as the Toyota Camry, and that will free the producers up to increase prices on all vehicles. We'll also see an increase in the price of used vehicles for the simple fact that people will be priced out of the new car market and push demand down into used cars. So we'll see very broad increases in prices, or as I like to say, there will be no place to hide from this. Perhaps less obvious will be the fact that we just simply will not see certain vehicles coming into our marketplace. This was brought home this week when Ford said no, it would not be, after President Trump tweeted that he wanted them to make this very low-cost vehicle that they had scheduled to produce in China and then export back to the United States. They said no, they will not be making it in the United States or exporting it to the United States. Obviously, with 25% tariff, that will be impossible. but it's also not going to be profitable and to make it in the United States, which means that that particular segment will not appear. Okay, so we have less choice. Some things will simply disappear from the market. Other things are going to be more expensive. Looking ahead, we know this is an area where we're going to see tremendous change. Electronic vehicles are coming, whether President Trump likes it or not. China is definitely on a path to become the world's largest consumer of electronic vehicles. Other countries are following. And one has to wonder if we will just simply be left out of it. This will not be the place to do R&D in electronic vehicles. This will not be the place to get the most technologically advanced vehicles. All that, of course, is extremely sad for anyone who's been in the marketplace recently, as I have, buying my son I would say, entry-level vehicle. But, you know, the industry has been doing very well. It was hit really hard in the Great Recession, there's no doubt about it, but jobs in the auto sector have grown much more rapidly than jobs overall. And the types of vehicles that are being produced in North America are terrific. It's very competitive. The amount of technology you can buy on a $20,000 to $23,000 vehicle sort of blows my mind. And yet we're risking all that for, it's not really clear what. So I think there's a lot at risk. We see NAFTA is kind of teeing that up and creating this fortress North America. And we have to really ask what is going to be the long-term cost of that in terms of U.S. competitiveness.
So let me switch gears a bit and ask Inu, if I may, the big sticking points for Canada. So we have dairy disputes, we have lumber disputes, we have all sorts of other disputes. And then on top of all that, we have a dispute settlement mechanism under dispute. So if you could say a few words about that, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah, I think the two top sticking points everyone's probably heard of in the last few weeks has been Chapter 19, the so-called mechanism to deal with anti-dumping and countervailing duty determinations by domestic agencies, and the other one would be the dairy issues. Dairy is kind of a mess. Dairy has always been a mess for Canada, but it's always been sort of a mess for the United States too. We all do different things subsidizing our producers. Canada has a quota system by which its producers make dairy products, and that's heavily controlled. Now, Canada can give a little on dairy. We saw this with TPP. They give about 3.25% of their market share in the TPP. That was given with the United States in mind. The whole thought was the U.S. would be in that agreement and they would fill that quota. The problem is with the U.S. out, a lot of that quota is probably going to remain empty, and Canada's pretty much okay with that, I think, at this point. So there is a little bit of tinkering that still has to be done to figure out what this extra market share is going to be in NAFTA. And that's going to be a really difficult thing for Canada to swallow, especially if the TPP countries like New Zealand, which are big dairy producers, decide to actually fulfill the quota that the U.S. left behind. So without the U.S. in that, there's a single problem for Canada there. Then there's this whole issue of this Class 7 milk product. Now, this is just a mess, and it's really difficult to get into what exactly it is. But suffice it to say, the Canadian producers had an agreement with their government about pricing a milk product below a certain price, which basically priced U.S. producers out of the market. This was a product that was created after NAFTA essentially came into force. So it's outside the tariff schedule for dairy products in Canada. And so they came up with this creative way to tinker with the rules to basically cut out U.S. producers. And that's what's happened. U.S. producers also have an oversupply. That itself is a problem that the U.S. has to address. So it's really kind of messy and complicated. At the end of the day, they can come to some sort of agreement. I don't think it's beyond logical that they can do this. Canada did it with the CETA, the agreement with the Europeans, in which they gave more access than they gave in TPP. So there is room to maneuver, and I think that's certainly something that we can settle. What that final compromise is, that's the big question. What's that final number they decide to? The other big issue is Chapter 19. Now, I think there's this big mythology around Chapter 19 in Canada, because when you look back to the original negotiations of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, it's just fascinating. It's fascinating because how excited Canada was to get this out of the United States. It's like, yes, we finally got them. And I feel like there's this feeling that we just need to keep it no matter what. And it's just something that we need to get because Canada won this against the United States and they caved to us for once. And so we need to keep it within this agreement. So there's that. And Canadians might have to take a hit, and they're going to be very upset if they do. But Chapter 19 is something they can live without. And when we look at the data, on what's happened with Chapter 19 cases and then what's happened with other cases that go to the Court of International Trade in the US, which is especially the equivalent of what Chapter 19 does. There's not much of a difference anymore. There used to be a concern in the 80s that the Court of International Trade was biased against foreigners, that it took too long for them to settle their cases, and that they had no expertise on trade matters. It's not clear to me that's a problem anymore. And most lawyers that we've talked to say that's not an issue, and they have no difference in opinion on whether they go to Chapter 19 panels or whether they go to the Court of International Trade. So for Canadian companies, there should be no problem to go through this domestic US process. So in many ways, I think Chapter 19 is like the last holdout. Canada's just keeping it right now, and I think a lot of it is negotiating bluster in order to get another concession from the United States. That's a good strategy, and that's what they should do, but I don't think Chapter 19 is the hill they should die on, and this shouldn't be what they keep at the end of the day. So if they can find a way to get something else from the United States, that's a good win for Canada, it's a good win for everyone, but I don't think these are issues that are so difficult they can't come to a solution. So we just hope Minister Freeland comes back soon and they can get this over with, because we're dying over here. So.
Thank you, Inu. Let me move to the audience and see if there are questions for our panelists. And we have a mic here with Michael Wiener in the back. So please raise your hand and he'll come to you.
Thanks. I was very intrigued by your last comment about Chapter 19, and you've obviously looked at the record of Chapter 19 versus CIT. And you're probably right in terms of the substance. But given that Prime Minister Trudeau has outlined this publicly as a red line, how does he convince the Canadians that CIT is just as good?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think politically it's going to be a tough sell. The way that I see it is that when you look at the comment that he made, he said, we need something like Chapter 19. He didn't say we need Chapter 19. So I take that as saying, okay, we just got to give them something that can cover dealing with these issues, either an agreement on the side where the parties agree to basically bring back sort of anti-dumping reform to the WTO, as the US is going to do with the EU. That's one way forward. Or to find another way, a side agreement to address some of these things. I think it's going to have to be done quite quietly, but I don't think Prime Minister Trudeau is going to lose anything with him not facing an election anytime soon of backtracking on this bit. So I think he can get away with it.
Any more questions? Over here. Michael, there's one here.
So I know at this stage we're still pretty scant on details, but I was curious about how this would affect the agricultural sector.
Anyone want to handle that? Well, it would not be good, as we have seen manifestations already happening in the U.S. We've seen, throughout the whole process has been very noisy, right? I mean, the NAFTA renegotiations officially started in August of 2017. And at first, there were several rounds of negotiations taking place in each country, sort of on an alternating basis. And then there came a point when everybody sort of realized that, well, this whole negotiation might actually unravel. Of course, that was not helped by some tweeting done by the White House on several different occasions. And then many states within the U.S. started to look at themselves and realize that, well, actually, we are very dependent on NAFTA, and this was particularly true. This was true of a lot of different states, but it was very true of agricultural producing ones. And they paid attention even more when Mexico started to, very marginally, but they did that, they started to buy soybeans and corn and other grains from Argentina and Brazil. Again, very marginally. The amounts that we're talking about here are small. But the effect of that was very symbolic in sort of driving members of Congress who represent some of these localities, as well as farmer associations in the U.S., to start speaking up. So everybody realized suddenly that there was a lot at stake if indeed NAFTA did unravel. And that sort of pushback that came from the agricultural side, and it also came from the manufacturing side, by the way, is what I think to a large extent, made these negotiations continue. It seems from the kinds of things that we've seen published that there were several points in time when the administration was sort of ready to pull the plug on NAFTA. And it didn't happen because some of these lawmakers and some of these representatives from particular industries and particular sectors, specifically from the agricultural sector, were very vocal in getting their point across that they were going to lose out in a very big way.
I was wondering, so if this trade agreement goes through, could you speak to how it might have some discrepancies with other trade agreements that Canada and Mexico have with the EU or other partners or with TPP? And somewhat separately, what does Mexico agreeing to quotas on autos mean for all the foreign manufacturers that manufacture autos in Mexico for export to the U.S.?
Yeah, sure. So I would say we do have to keep an eye out for where the overlaps are going to be. So in TPP, that's going to be the main thing we're going to compare NAFTA to in many ways to see how much they borrowed. So when we look at the e-commerce chapter, trade and environment, probably going to be copied and pasted in many ways. And so seeing that difference is going to be important. Remember, NAFTA had side letters to labor and environment. So it's going to be really interesting to see what they actually do to the actual chapters. NAFTA also created 2 institutions to deal with this. We don't know what's going on with these institutions either. So we got to find out soon enough what's going to happen there. There's other issues too with IP. So on intellectual property rights, there was an extension of the copyright term from 70 to 75 years in the new NAFTA, and from TPP, which is at 70, and also for biologic drugs. The data exclusivity period is now at 10 years in the NAFTA. There's a discrepancy with 5 years in the TPP plus extra you can get if you meet certain provisions. That's problematic for Canada because Canada's domestic law requires them to have only 8 years of exclusivity. So this is going to be an issue for that and also for compliance with this other agreement. With the EU, an interesting thing that's kind of tucked inside the NAFTA release was this provision that said that you're not allowed to protect the origins of cheese names. So like feta and all of a sudden Europeans are kind of up in arms about this because this is going to be really difficult for the Canada-EU agreement where Canada basically agreed to protect these cheese names. So I have no idea how this is going to work out. Like this is kind of a mess when you think about it and how they're going to sort this. It's going to be very complicated. But that's going to be something to see. What that provision looks like, it's going to be very interesting. And I think we're going to have to keep an eye on unraveling this massive spaghetti bowl.
Thank you.
Can I just add one thing there?
Yes.
So I do think it's interesting to think about the fact that Canada will be in TPP and we will not be. And this desire to tighten rules of origin that stems from that. You can imagine that Canada becomes more deeply integrated into the Asia-Pacific through TPP, and the U.S. Would be worried about competition from that integration, particularly through supply chains. So the fact that we're not in TPP is also driving some of this, I think, behavior that we're seeing.
Yeah.
Could you just talk about the politics of this in Mexico? And specifically, is there any chance that these negotiations don't conclude before the new government takes over? And if so, what happens?
This is precisely the topic of our next panel. So we will be dealing with that very soon. Any more questions? There's one over here, Michael. Let me collect a couple or maybe 3 questions because we're right at the end of our time. There are a couple of questions. Rand Hayes over here.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. Can you give a sort of a professorial, just sort of a basic analysis of what Trump has repeatedly called for, which is international trade tariffs with the U.S. to drop to 0 for everybody, no exceptions. He calls for that over and over again. And his objective, among other things, is, he says, to end the debasement of our currency by the unending massive current account deficits. So what I'm looking for is just, is Trump wrong in his goal of saying we ought to have zero tariffs? Because I'm sort of thinking of Milton Friedman, but is probably jumping for joy even in his grave.
Well, while Mike circulates the microphone, let me take a stab at that. So the zero tariffs from all sides, that would include the U.S. So if the U.S. wants other countries to lower their tariffs to zero, the U.S. is going to have to lower its tariffs to zero. And I don't think the calculus has actually been made to substantiate that kind of statement in terms of what it would ultimately imply. So it's one of these sort of broad brush political statements that are thrown out there without the actual data to back it up and to actually be able to trace what it effectively means. The debasement of the currency because of a current account deficit, this is something that is just not true. The dollar is the international reserve currency, period. There's no other international reserve currency circulating in the world. You have other currencies that come a little bit close to that, but fall very short of being actual international reserve currencies. And the dollar has maintained its status despite the different bouts of turbulence that we've lived through in the past few years. The current account deficit has a counterpart. So when you're looking at the overall payment structure, or balance of payment structure of a country, there's the current account balance, and then there's the financial accounts. You know, the balance of payments are composed of both. So if you're running a high current account deficit with the rest of the world, basically what's happening is that a lot of people, a lot of countries from around the world are actually investing in your assets. So money is flowing into the U.S. That's the other side of a current account deficit, is an investment surplus. So there's a surplus coming in from the other side, which is to say a current account deficit alone says absolutely nothing about the state of the currency, the state of the macroeconomy, whether things are good or bad. You can't make value judgments on the face of having a current account deficit. It just means that you're buying more from the rest of the world, and the rest of the world, the counterpart to that is the rest of the world is investing more in the U.S. So if you were to bring the current account deficit of the U.S. to zero, that would have an implication for investment in the U.S. Not a good one. So that's something to think about. Let me collect two more questions and then before we end the panel.
So you mentioned that it would be unprecedented for minimum wage policy to be baked into a trade agreement, and I'm wondering whether that would be a good thing. I mean, if it were to raise wages for Mexican workers, that seems like something like a worthy goal, but could it have adverse consequences?
Okay.
And my question was, you had mentioned at the outset that the view of the people in the White House and the administration on trade is very different from the one in the larger academic community. And clearly what they're doing with NAFTA doesn't make sense to you guys. But how does it make sense to them? What kind of alternate theory are they operating under that would make this make sense in their minds?
Thank you. So on the question of minimum wages, we're going to discuss that at greater length in the following panel. But let me just say this. There's an enforceability problem. When you stipulate a minimum wage requirement in a trade agreement, who's going to enforce it? Because ultimately, minimum wage policy is a sovereign issue. So it's something that's governed by a sovereign government. So we can discuss whether this is something that is desirable or not. And certainly in the case of Mexico, as we will be talking about in the next panel, there is an issue with wages, with the minimum wage policy even not being strictly adhered to. But be that as it may, doing this, trying to do minimum wage policy in a trade agreement does not have any kind of enforceability attached to it and doesn't have any kind of political legitimacy either. Because as I said, this is a sovereign policy issue. This is a government policy issue, which is very politically charged usually. So there's a lot to unravel there, and we'll do that in the following panel. and
Can I just have one?
Mary.
Yeah. So the other question about the minimum wage is the fact that this is being done bilaterally.
Yeah.
When you think about it, Mexico still has to compete with other countries. And by raising its minimum wage, particularly in certain sectors that it may not want to do on its own, just to appease the United States, it puts itself at disadvantage in other areas. There are still many poor areas of Mexico. It has its own development agenda. And for the United States to then tell Mexican citizens how they're going to develop because of our relationship just with us, it puts us at a disadvantage. This is not like we're all in a multilateral setting talking about how to raise wages for the world's poorest workers.
Right.
And I would add one more thing to that, actually, because think about what trade agreements are supposed to do, right? It's to lower trade barriers. And right now, what we're ending up doing is to add more and more stuff in trade agreements that have nothing to do with trade at all. And we have to ask ourselves, for all the people who have had this populist backlash against trade, who want to add more stuff into trade agreements, is this really what we want to do? Do we think trade can actually solve all these problems? No, it can't. And adding in chapters and all these other things that are unrelated to it is not going to solve those problems that are domestic policy issues. And so this really is a debate that has to happen at the domestic level in a lot of these countries to adjust their policies as they see fit, as they should do, as they want. And so I wonder whether it's even relevant at the global governance level to discuss these issues that are so different in each country. So in that case, I don't think they really should be in the trade agreement at all.
Thank you, Inu. And as for the final question, do any of you want to address the mindset of the administration?
I would just say
think
it
you've already
is
spoken.
not Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman knew what the difference between the capital account and the current account. And there is this video of Ronald Reagan, which is going around among people, which is sort of funny because many of them are not Republicans, where he says it's great that we have a trade deficit. It shows how many people have faith in America and want to invest in America. So he did understand that the counterpart to the current account deficit was the capital account surplus. So there is no one voice in this administration. We have very different voices. In the end, I do believe it will be President Trump who makes the decision, and that is partly why I think that we were very likely to get the auto tariffs.
So with that, let me thank our panelists who were very eloquent and great. And we will switch over to our other agenda. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so our second panel is more on the political economy of NAFTA and on the specific politics playing out on the ground with respect to the negotiations in Mexico and in Canada. And I have two very distinguished professors here from SAIS, Professor Francisco Gonzalez, who teaches both in international political economy as well department as well as in the Latin American Studies program, and then to his right, Christopher Sands, who was my co-conspirator on this for this event today. Actually, he put together most of it, but he's the director of Canadian Studies, for those of you who don't know. And let me just kick it off with the question that everybody has in their minds: politics in Mexico and NAFTA. Going back to the question that was asked earlier.
Here we go. 10 minutes, no more. Thanks for having us, Monica. Brilliant and very timely event. Why did Mexico and the US go it alone? The simple answer to that is a mutual fear of the short-term future. In the United States, there's going to be midterm elections, November the 6th. In Mexico, there have been already what are considered revolutionary elections, elections that have brought not only the first left-wing president to the executive branch since the 1930s, but also simple plurality majorities in both chambers of the Federal Congress. Well, they will be controlled by the left. This had never happened before. So in the run-up to the change of government in Mexico, and there was a question about will it happen before the current government steps down or after? That happens on December the 1st. This left-wing coalition and very strong bloc, supported very significantly by a comfortable majority of the Mexican electorate, will take power. That's number one. That's on the Mexican side. On the American side, of course, one of the main issues is, and someone in the previous panel mentioned it, one of the key topics that propelled Mr. Trump to the presidency was NAFTA, the worst trade deal ever in the history of humankind. Mr. Trump has to get something, a piece of paper, a shake of hands with the Mexican president, to go and be able to show the core base and the floating electorate that he's promised, he's delivered. There's no more NAFTA. Even if it's just a change in name, the symbolism of that is important for the political electoral calendar and for what's coming in November the 6th. So at the end of the day, what we have is an outgoing government, the Mexican government, which is a neoliberal, pro-Washington, pro-free trade, pro-IMF, pro-World Bank. They're leaving. They've been in power since the 1980s in one guise or another, two different parties, center and center-right. They colonized the economic policy establishment, and they made what are known as neoliberal policy basket as something written in stone. For the first time in more than a quarter of a century, that is being called, that is not written in stone anymore. And there could be changes. Radical, revolutionary, no, highly unlikely. Changes on the margins, certain changes of substance, highly likely. So the outgoing government is really desperate to strike a deal with the US, because for this generation of US, European trained technocrats who support neoclassical economics and who made it really the bread and butter of economic policy making in Mexico for more than a quarter of a century, the potential of ending with nothing, the potential with President Trump's bluff becoming a reality and losing a market for 80% of Mexico's exports is catastrophic. So they gave in, and we can get into the content, agriculture, autos, in a different iteration. They gave in order to simply be able to lock in 85% of what's on the table and has been on the table the last 24, 25 years. On the side of the US, there was, as mentioned, the positive incentive for the current administration of having something at least symbolically tangible. We are delivering. NAFTA does not exist anymore. Now it's going to be called the US-Mexico trade deal or the US-Canada-Mexico trade deal. It's not NAFTA, even if 95% of things remain the same. That's the positive. The negative one, of course, is exactly the incoming left-wing government in Mexico. This was a surprise not only to Mexicans, but also to Americans, to pollsters all over the world. The magnitude of the victory by the left had not been really forecast. And therefore, the United States suddenly finds itself with the possibility of having on the other side of the table a not neoliberal, in fact anti-neoliberal, nationalist, not anti-American, but Mexicanist, pro-Mexicanist, a nationalist, populist government that wants to have as its number one priority social justice issues. And regarding NAFTA, of course, as everyone knows, there have been winners and losers. We've talked a lot about many of the winners. The auto industry, no doubt, has helped Mexico and propelled its economy very significantly. Mexico in the late 1980s was a petrolized economy, not as bad as Venezuela. 98% of its exports were not oil, but 85% were. It's very difficult to imagine or try to go back to those times. Today, more than 25% of our GDP is manufacturing. And the horsepower behind that is the auto industry. So there have been a lot of benefits there for Mexican workers, for Mexican suppliers, for people who rent land. But there have been very significant losers. And the agricultural side, something that I'm happy to talk about subsequently, is one of them. So there's a significant constituency in Mexico that's backing the incoming left-wing government and would be happy to see them negotiating in a sterner fashion than the outgoing government has been doing it. So at the end of the day, we end up with this critical juncture where these two governments are aware about very significant impending political changes which might jeopardize everything that's been done, not only the last 13 months of negotiations, but in fact the 24, 25, close to 25 years of agreement.
Thank you, Francisco. So we've had, since the negotiations started in August of last year, we had at first all of the very strong rhetoric against Mexico. And Mexico trades with us unfairly, treats us unfairly, everything's unfair when it comes to Mexico. And then all of a sudden this shifted into Canada, and it became about Canada. So Canada is very unfair. Canada trades with us very unfairly. We're going to sideline Canada and we're going to speak only to Mexico. And then we're going to force Canada back to the table once we have struck a deal with Mexico. How's this going down in Canada?
Well, not very well. I think a lot of Canadians are a little surprised. They never thought they'd be the villain. They're so nice. And I think it worries them sometimes to think that Donald Trump may be convincing Americans who know Canadians pretty well that they are this evil force to the north that threatens us, like on southern Ontario, a dagger poked at the heart of America. It's just not the way the Canadians are used to being seen or even see themselves. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is you have to give the Canadians, I think, a lot of credit. They're a very mature people in terms of the relationship with the United States. When Stephen Harper was the previous prime minister was in office, he started with George W. Bush. They were both conservative and they liked each other. And then Harper had to adjust to Obama. They didn't see the world in the same way, but Stephen Harper knew that he had to be pragmatic and deal with the United States. And he did more or less well, but he at least tried. When Justin Trudeau was elected, he had a bromance with Barack Obama. They got along really, really well. But that was brief because then we had Donald Trump. And Justin Trudeau insisted that there would be no cheap shots at the Americans in the press. Everyone's going to try to do their best to have positive, constructive, not personal relations, with the president and with his administration. And they maintained that dignified, friendly approach all the way through the start of the negotiations and then as the negotiations proceeded, up until this summer, as we approached the one-year mark, at which point it was very difficult for Justin Trudeau to point to anything that all that niceness had achieved. Canada was being hit hard with steel aluminum tariffs. They still had softwood tariffs. They just escaped a Boeing Bombardier dumping case, more because of the ITC than anything else. And it really was a lack of visit. In fact, the president is the first president to wait so long to visit Canada. Usually the U.S. president goes up to Canada fairly early. The president went up in June for the G7 meeting in Charlevoix, which was his first time visiting Canada as president, which quite unusual, the delay. And that turned out to be a turning point where the Trudeau government was trying to show Canadians that they weren't completely selling out to the Americans. They were being firm and friendly, but they were trying not to be poodles or whatever the metaphor for being a U.S. patsy is. And in that moment, as they started just saying, well, we have some differences and some deals wouldn't be acceptable to us and we have to stand up for ourselves, the president left the summit and accused Justin Trudeau of being a lying backstabber and traitor and so forth. And not only that, his minions then came out. I guess you could call them minions. I don't want to. But presidential advisors who were able to come out and then also take cheap shots at Justin Trudeau. And we were talking in the previous panel about electoral politics, and Canadian electoral politics matter here too, in that Justin Trudeau was elected in 2015. The Canadians adopted recently a fixed election date system. So although they're a parliamentary system and you could call an election at any time, they have an election expected, ceteris paribus, or all things being equal, on October 21st, 2019. And so the problem now is that the Prime Minister, knowing he has an election next year, is looking at how a NAFTA renegotiation is likely to affect him. And his opposition, the Conservatives and the NDP, have largely supported the government in the negotiation of the NAFTA. They haven't taken too many shots, but we're already starting to see the electoral impact, and it's happening at the provincial level. First, we saw the election of Doug Ford to Ontario. Doug Ford, for those of you who remember, Rob Ford, his brother, who was mayor of Toronto, he is the sort of clean and sober brother of, he's not on cocaine, thank goodness, but he is a populist and he's a former city politician, and he has used that platform now that he's premier of Canada's largest province to criticize the government's carbon tax approach and other things. There's a fear, I think, among some of the Liberals that his next move is to say the auto industry is in big trouble, and it's in big trouble because of NAFTA, and it's in big trouble because of Trudeau. Time to get rid of him. And because as premier, he doesn't have to solve the problem, he just has to raise the alarm, it's almost too good for the media to pass up. Quebec has an election on October 1st, the day that we may or may not see the text of whatever was agreed between the U.S. and Mexico. That election right now favors an insurgent populist party, the Coalition for the Future of Quebec, not the incumbent party, which is liberal like Justin Trudeau. We have an election next spring before the federal election in Alberta. And Alberta has a NDP Social Democratic government, which is now behind in the polls to a conservative alternative party run by a cabinet minister, former cabinet minister of Stephen Harper's, quite charismatic. So the political calculus for Justin Trudeau is bad, in that he needs to be firm and fair, and he needs to come out more than anything else with a deal, because Canadians know how important NAFTA has been to them. And they really just don't understand how their old friends, the Americans, could treat them this way. And maybe, if I could say the worst thing of it all, is that Canadians do like us here in the United States. And in case you're wondering, Francisco is Mexican, but I'm not Canadian. I'm just from Detroit. But the Canadians really do like us, and they know us well. And so, in some cases, say in U.S.-China relations, ordinary Chinese people see nothing but Trump and may wonder if the Americans have all gone crazy. But if you have Canadian friends, you probably see this. The Canadians know the Americans are still nice. They know the Americans are still their friends. They think Trump is an aberration. And so they have managed this so far without it becoming a real disaster for the trade, for the economy. There was a brief attempt to boycott American products that didn't go very well. They mostly are ready to forgive us for Trump and do a deal if a reasonable one can be arrived at, much as Inu said in the previous panel. So that's the awkward position of the government, and it's where we find ourselves now.
Thank you. So let me explore or dive deeper into another question with both of you. Francisco talked at length about this tectonic shift in Mexican politics that has just occurred, and how there will be very soon in place a government that is very unlike the current government, which will soon be the previous government, in the way that they think about policies, in the way that they position themselves. You use the word nationalist a few times. So it makes one wonder, given that the Trump administration's position is a nationalist position in so many respects. And then you have an incoming administration in Mexico that also has nationalist leanings. Then you have Canada, which currently does not have nationalist leanings, but some provinces might, or might start moving in that direction. I wonder if both of you could comment on this. If it takes a while for the final NAFTA deal, if there is one, to finally come to fruition, how do these shifts in the makeup of the two governments with the nationalistic bent of the U.S. administration, how does that come together and give us something that makes sense in terms of a free trade agreement?
Right. Very, very good question, very substantial. On the Mexican side, prima facie, it might appear as if having a strong nationalist, nativist in power in the US, which had not been the case for a long time, and also having one in Mexico, which used to be the case up until the 1980s, would be the worst of all worlds for those people who believe in free trade, for those people who want to build bridges rather than walls. Once we scratch the surface of this proposition, the reality is that the incoming government in Mexico is quite pragmatic. It's a government that understands that the livelihood of a majority of Mexicans, that the rate of growth of the economy of for the country, which has been very mediocre, not even 2% per annum the last 20 years, at least in real terms, inflation under control. But key issues regarding the promise to deliver social justice, to deliver results that close one of the widest gaps in income and wealth distribution anywhere in the world. The country is sadly in the box with 20% most unequal countries anywhere in the world. So it's in the company of some sub-Saharan African, South Asian countries, and many Latin American countries like Chile, like Brazil, like Colombia. If this government is going to be successful, it does not believe in the Venezuela formula of starting to nationalize, return to statism, not even to the middle way house, if you want to call it that way, that Brazil under Lula, under Dilma, or Argentina under the Kirchners adopted. That was not wholesale 21st century socialist revolution like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, but it was a significant move towards statist, nationalist policies. In Mexico, what you have is, on the one hand, a level of rhetoric which is strongly resonant with the majority, because the majority have not seen the benefits of free trade and of this, in theory, mutually beneficial association with the United States and Canada. And on the other, you have a country which is very well acquainted with recurrent financial crises since the 1970s. Crises which took place first and foremost due to the types of nationalist, interventionist policies such as capital controls, quota systems, licensing agreements for imports and exports, many distortions in the economy landed Mexico in dreadful financial circumstances in 1976, in 1982, in 1988-89, and just when NAFTA was being signed in 1994-95. We have not seen that since then. And the left is aware about this. So we do not have in power an ideological led left. We have one that is pragmatic, that is focused on delivering results. And that being said, the main issue then depends on the relationship between these two nationalists. Can they get along? Is President-elect Andrés Manuel López Obrador going to get on President Trump's hairs? The likelihood is very likely, because almost anyone gets into President Trump's hairs. Anyone and everyone. Humans, animals, vegetables, minerals. So that, I think we have to discount that. President Trump might very easily pick up a fight with the new Mexican president, as he has picked up fights with the Prime Minister of Canada, with the President of France, with the President of China, almost with the President of Russia, but for some reason not. Thinking about the Mexican side, people have talked a lot about López Obrador as an ideologue, as a quintessential populist. He is, but he's incredibly pragmatic. This is the third time he ran for the presidency. First time, the presidential race probably was stolen. We still don't know about 2006. 2012 was a different story, and he lost by 5 points. But in the run-up to 2018, really, this is someone who's ended up, when people started dissecting the electoral results, trying to make sense of how the poorest and the most highly educated Mexicans could have voted for this man. So people with tertiary postgraduate education and people without having completed junior high school voted 3 or 4 to 1 for López Obrador. Urban and rural. The following he has is genuine. His way of approaching things is pragmatic. He'll smile, he'll talk very, very slowly, and it will be difficult to get in his hairs. This is someone who's learned the virtues of Buddhist appeasement, because the fiery brand that he used to espouse did not catapult him to the presidency. The previous 2 times, particularly the first one, he lost a lot of appeal when during the post-electoral conflict he said, institutions go to hell. Las instituciones al diablo. A lot of the middle class, the educated, as well as the poor popular support he'd garnered, ended up distancing themselves from him after those pronouncements after 2006. So this is someone who's ended up having, maybe by his minions, his staff, the people that surround him, forced him to mellow down. Is he on medications? He probably must be, because his personality is dramatically different from the pre and post 2015 individual. As long as he takes his medicine, therefore, it's hard to see him becoming a child and then trying to start poking President Trump's eye.
It's just a very interesting segue. You might not think there were necessarily connections, but there are a few in the Canadian case, one of which is institutions. So for those of you who don't follow Canada-US relations, Canada is a small country that's intensely focused on the U.S. because of its high degree of trade dependency with the U.S. and security dependency, and the fact that it's relatively isolated in the world. It's sort of on the northern end of the Americas with one neighbor, Russia sort of, but mostly it's Greenland also, but mostly the United States. And the United States, which has always had a more global, far-reaching ambition and worldview. And so the way the two have learned to get along is by agreements that set up institutions that take the politics out of the management of the relationship. Starting in the beginning of the 20th century, we signed a Boundary Waters Treaty that created an international joint commission that looks at management of the Great Lakes, water quality, for a while it was looking at acid rain, invasive species, and presidents don't need to worry about that at all. It's all humming along below the surface. We have an air defense agreement, NORAD, that was set up in the early Cold War to protect our shared airspace because we feared that Soviet bombers would come over the northern part of North America, and we needed an institution. And when it is needed, it is not necessary to go back to the President of the United States, as on 9/11, when a Canadian deputy commander was in charge of NORAD, and we needed to do something because we didn't know what the nature of the attack was. The Canadians simply ordered American and Canadian fighters to secure the airspace. And it didn't have to go back to the political leaders. And that wasn't trying to get around the politics, it was because the politics were settled. Right. NAFTA is now the most central institution in the Canada-US relationship. And what I think is unnerving the Canadians is that shaking up of something foundational that they thought was settled. If you go back before Canada-US free trade to the days of the Auto Pact, Canadians were more interventionist in the economy. They were feeling as the smaller partner in North America that they were going to have to intervene a bit, help their companies out, have some state-owned enterprises. Over time, we convinced them to give those protections up in the spirit of free trade. And now, I know it drives some of the American side crazy, Chrystia Freeland gives a better speech on the virtues of free trade and how it's helped global growth than does anyone, I think, in the Trump administration. And they're really just telling us our story back to us because this was something we had been trying to convince them. So that dynamic is real. The second thing that we have done that's causing problems, you are all so good looking and fabulous, but imagine that you have a good friend growing up who is not so good looking. So you get all the dates and, they're just not as good looking as you are. Or maybe they're not as rich as you are. We all have these asymmetries in our friendships. And if you want to stay friends, you don't mention them. You just don't bring it up. It's not that it's not true. It's just bad form to rub the other guy's face in it. And so the funny thing about Canada-US relations is that we operate as if we're equals. We do joint things as partners. This is a kind of treatment I think Mexico would dream of if they could get that kind of treatment and respect. But Canada's used to it, and so it comes as a bit of a shock that Donald Trump, talking about how he thinks about things. I think Donald Trump believes in bilateral negotiations, and the U.S. has the upper hand, and it's going to play hardball and get a good deal because, as he said, Canada needs a deal with the United States more than the U.S. needs a deal with Canada, which is true as far as it goes. It's just not usually done to say that, and even more to press the point. And I think that leads me to my sort of where we go. I don't think the Canadians will become nationalist. They have a little bit of nationalism, it's just quite benign. But I think the weakness of the way that we're negotiating is that we think we can do a deal, sign it, like this agreement in principle, which isn't actually worked out yet, and that everything will be fixed. And after the ribbon has been cut and we've declared a whole new era, what you'll see from the Canadians is what a weaker partner usually does, which is very quietly work to protect their own under the new rules. The president focuses on dairy because it's one of the few products for which there is a relatively high Canadian tariff. What we really have in terms of market access barriers are misaligned regulations. And we have had, under the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and the Obama administration, a regulatory alignment, regulatory cooperation dialogue that was really aimed at getting rid of those barriers. Regulatory cooperation requires trust. It requires close inner workings between the government. It's not necessarily going to happen after an agreement signed in ill will that leaves Canadians not sure they can trust us in the same way that they did. Not all of us, but at least some of us. And so that's where we're going. The gradual unraveling of some of the openness and easy access to Canada. And I don't mean to make that sound like the Canadians really are as evil as Trump thinks they are, but you know, they're a smaller partner, and their government has to look out for Canadians, and they're very competitive in a lot of ways, but they're going to look for ways that they can help their own. And I think that will be to the detriment both of Canadians in the long run, but in the short run for Americans.
Thank you. Before I turn to the audience, let me ask, just going back to the question on minimum wage, both of you to weigh in on that. So you, Francisco, spoke a lot about the social justice platform of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. How does this minimum wage requirement that's now built into the preliminary agreement in principle, how does that square off with the social justice platform? And how does Canada respond to this, given that the issue of low wages in Mexico has always been a big sticking point for Canada?
So very quickly, this is an incredible paradox. No one would have ever believed that a nativist, nationalist US president would potentially be the champion of Mexican workers. And he might end up being that. Not of all the workers, by the way. This applies to the auto industry, but as mentioned, this is the most dynamic sector of Mexican manufacturing. If 40% of cars built in Mexico were to be required to be built by people who earn at least $16 per hour, that would put pressure on all wages, skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled. The problem for workers in Mexico is that they have, since the 1980s, I mentioned the 4 recurrent financial crises, they lost a lot of their bargaining capacity. The most important objective for a Mexican ended up just clinging by their nails to a formal sector job. If you manage to have that, you're already part of the privileged. And more than 50% of the economically active population does not have that. So wages in Mexico are regulated by a national commission of minimum wages, which is a typical tripartite setting, institutional setting, where the state gets employers and workers' leaders to agree on negotiations about the wage. As mentioned, given the recipe that Mexican governments followed between the 80s and now, a neoliberal recipe, whereby the mantra was to remain competitive, our competitiveness lies in cheap labor, cheap wages. And that has been time and again the argument made for carrying out what is known as wage repression. Productivity gains in manufacturing areas such as the auto industry, since the early 2010s, aerospace, which has grown significantly in Mexico thanks to US and Canadian producers. Aside from those, most other segments have not seen major improvements in their everyday wages. So the great paradox here, and if it does happen, then it'll be a case study that has to be written about, that whatever and however many tactics and strategies workers' leaders in Mexico tried since the 1980s to make wage gains for their affiliates, and they failed. It's now the make or break of this trilateral, potentially bilateral agreement, and the US blessing of that agreement and saying, if you don't do this, we just walk away. That ends up, in fact, carrying out a revolution in wages in Mexico. It's incredible.
It's very interesting to watch when you watch Canada-U.S. Relations, because in a funny way, and I say this not being a Mexico expert, López Obrador seems in some ways to me to be a mashup of Justin Trudeau and Donald Trump. You have this nationalistic man who runs against the establishment, who challenges Mexico City and champions the people that NAFTA left behind. And a man of the left who is a progressive, who, like Justin Trudeau, is concerned about ordinary people and social justice. And so it's an interesting paradox, to use your word, Francisco, and I think in general has left the Canadians a little uncertain how to deal with the new government. I think what Justin Trudeau can take, I think, justifiable credit for is really repairing Mexico-Canadian relations. Under Stephen Harper, they'd become quite contentious over some migration that was unanticipated and coming from Mexico into Canada that led to a visa requirement on Mexicans to come into Canada that was not well received. There were a few high-profile criminal cases in which Canadians were in Mexico and something happened to them and they became sympathetic cases where Canadians would have a lot of concern about the corruption or the rule of law in Mexico. And Trudeau's really reached out, but he reached out to the Peña Nieto establishment and has relatively good relations with them. I'm not sure he knows what to do yet with López Obrador. If we're lucky, one of the things we'll get out of this is much better Canada-Mexico relations. It's always been the weakest end of the NAFTA triangle, partly because we were in the middle, but I think the two countries have started to see that they have some common interests, and that might make things improve in the future.
A positive note, that's always good. So let's turn to the audience. We have only a few minutes remaining. Again, okay, so Michael.
Thank you. I'm interested in your thoughts on whether you think the U.S. is a reliable negotiator in these talks. And Chrystia Freeland answered that question by saying that she was negotiating with Ambassador Lighthizer, and yet the U.S. has to deliver both Congress and the President and on any deal.
Are you taking a couple, or should I just go?
Let's take a couple.
Okay.
Let's take three, actually. There's one more here, and then.
That works because mine's in a similar vein, which is I agree that Minister Freeland's been quite eloquent and impressive, but I guess there's a larger strategic question, which is, given that the United States is the dominant player, did she misplay her hand by walking away or staying away from the tables for so long? And doesn't that give some credence to the criticism that's been coming from Premier Ford?
Yep.
And one more here, Michael.
Hi, I have a couple questions actually, and I should preface this by saying that I negotiated 2 of the chapters in the new NAFTA. But my question on the minimum wage commitment and there not being an enforceability mechanism, if it does become a binding agreement, wouldn't that be a dispute settlement issue then? If it's subject to dispute settlement, that would be the enforceability mechanism, right? Second question about tariffs. There's a lot of trade agreements now out there, and tariffs are pretty low, and it's just one chapter actually of a trade agreement. And are you looking at non-tariff barriers and the impact of removing those? Is that something that, I know it's hard to quantify the impact of that, but in general, is academia kind of looking at that and the impact of that? And my third question is, as has been noted, NAFTA is over 20 years old. Do you think it's worth updating existing agreements, or should we be pursuing a different strategy such as plurilateral or multilateral agreements through the WTO, like the Trade Facilitation Agreement? Is that a better strategy, or is it worth looking at these old ones and updating those as well? And what would be on your wish list then?
you want to take the first two? And
Sure.
I take
Okay.
You take
this
the last
one?
one? Okay. We just divided it up very reasonably. This is the future. So the first thing is, are we a reliable negotiating partner? This is a very unusual negotiation. Normally, presidents and prime ministers are the good cops, expressing confidence that something good will come out, and then the negotiators in the back room are the tough guys, and they work towards a tough deal, but that hard bargaining is at least predictable and expected. This has been unusual for two reasons. One, because the U.S. president has played bad cop along with his trade negotiators, so there isn't necessarily an American good cop out there. And the second thing that's unusual is that this is the first time we've had a negotiation this intense with social media. And so I often think about one of our problems in U.S. politics now being the WebMD moment we're in, which is that everyone has a lot of information. And just as, when WebMD came out, people would go to their doctor and say, oh, I think what I have. I've read all my symptoms, and I think it's this. And the doctor would say, well, wait a minute, I'm the doctor. Let me explain it to you. That relationship between establishment specialists and the people is one that is being changed in trade policy. People have their own opinions about what a good agreement is. And so the negotiators playing bad cop and the vigorous debate about what all these provisions mean, I think makes it very hard to negotiate, period, even irrespective of how we behave. Then there's the congressional component, which I agree you're right to focus on. The Trade Promotion Authority Bill of 2015, which is what we're operating under, was granted for President Obama. It is the most interventionist by Congress since the Trade Act of 1974 in terms of oversight, demanding reports, demanding details. And the Trump administration, for all the criticism that they're unpredictable, has been pretty good about meeting all of its requirements. And the Congress, even though it gave itself a lot of role in the talks, has not played a very big role. They've been waiting to see what comes out of it. So I think Congress is the X factor. And depending on how this agreement settles or what we're looking at, we've seen members of Congress talking about adding Canada back in after the fact if they get left behind, or asking for new negotiations, something we haven't seen for quite a long time. So I feel that the U.S. is not a very predictable or certainly reliable negotiating partner because of all of that churn. And maybe this is the new normal. We'll have to see. With regard to Chrystia Freeland, I'm hesitant to criticize the way that she's conducted the negotiations, in part because I think she's been figuring things out as she goes. And she's a very articulate spokesperson for the government's policy. Having been a journalist, she really knows how to talk like a SAIS student, if you put it that way, about trade. And she's been trying to find a way to keep the Canadian public on side while she's negotiating with the U.S. That said, she's also taken on the bad cop role to let the Prime Minister try to stay back and above the fray. And I think some of the criticism that's been aimed at her is because of the role that she's been assigned. And just for those of you who care about Canadian politics, there are some people who suggest that she's practically the Deputy Prime Minister, that she's gunning for the Prime Minister's job down the road, and that does happen sometimes in parliamentary systems. But I think the fact that she's been willing to be so out front and criticize is a suggestion that she's putting her job first and not worried too much about the ambition, at least at this point. But Francisco.
And just very quickly, on non-tariff and countervailing duties, very little on the surface has been revealed. My sense is that, as my colleague Chris mentioned beforehand, whatever it is that ends up being hammered out, whatever agreement ends up being hammered out, the likelihood is that it's going to be more geared towards U.S. interests, in as much as the U.S. is the strongest party. Both countries, Mexico and Canada, depend much more on the U.S. than the other way around. Once something is hammered out, you can bet that Canadians and Mexicans are going to try to not restore, but try to create as good as conditions as they can manage with the new rules that might be a bit less beneficial than the previous ones were, by focusing on these types of elements which usually have less visibility in the radar screen of news wires, newspapers, what have you. So I think that's extra ammunition that the weaker ones are keeping to potentially use. On the minimum wage, you're absolutely right. There's, and as Monica also mentioned it at the beginning of this session, this is a first, and so therefore there's no precedent to understand how these things work. In the absence of an enforcing mechanism, what people have been talking about is parallel agreements that would create commissions where Canadian, American, and Mexicans would sit to monitor the wage situation in Mexico. Problems with that, the issue of sovereignty, the issue that the Mexican government, even if they commit to it a priori, after the fact, they might very well turn to the public and say, what's this? This is unacceptable intervention. Where else in the world is this happening? Nowhere else. We should not agree to this. So you're absolutely right in saying that organized labor, both in the US and in Canada, do not trust Mexican government and Mexican government's implementation of policies, of their laws. For that matter, Mexican labor and Mexicans in general do not trust what their government implements. So that's in the air. And lastly, on the pluralization, multilateralism rather than trilateral, Mexico has said, and there's very little that this outgoing administration has said. They have not given details about this preliminary agreement that they've agreed to with the United States. But one thing they've said is that the same basic provisions regarding tariffs, because you mentioned about many other trade agreements having relatively low tariffs, that there was no way that Mexico was going to give in to having different conditions from those that they signed up to in TPP, which has not been implemented, or the free trade agreement that Mexico, in fact, has with the European Union, signed in 1999, 2000, an agreement that functions, and which creates a level playing field which is consonant, by and large, with WTO rules. So that's at least what they're saying.
Thank you both. Let me make just one observation, and I'm afraid we've run out of time for questions, on the updating of agreements rather than going at it regionally. Let's just step back a bit and remind ourselves that the NAFTA renegotiation or the updating of NAFTA would have happened naturally had TPP come into effect. It would, both Canada and Mexico were in TPP, and NAFTA would have been automatically updated had TPP come into effect. Since TPP did not come into effect, we are in this situation where we are renegotiating NAFTA. And in principle, when you have agreements that are, 24 years old, the economy changes. So evidently, updating is needed. So there's nothing wrong with updating. There's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't make much sense to just scratch it all up and start from scratch, because you already have an agreement in place. So it makes all the sense in the world to update it. I'm sorry that we have run out of questions. This was an extremely interesting panel. I at least thought so. I learned a lot. I hope you all did too. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to our distinguished panelists for their time and for their answers. And with
and
that,
a great audience.
And a great audience with great questions. And with that, I'm calling the adjournment of this panel. Thank you.